This is the Neoliberal Around podcast.
But let's pick up from where we left off, and because there's so much that we have to cover in the class today. Are you guys there? Are you guys still there?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. We're here.
What we're doing right now is we're defining some terms, very important terms for you guys to understand. One, we talked about the fact that what is the Caribbean? That the Caribbean is not merely a group of islands surrounded by the Caribbean Sea, because to do so would be to erase places like Guyana and Belize, because we know that they consider themselves Caribbean. So there is no question about whether or not they're Caribbean. They are Caribbean as much as we consider ourselves Caribbean. They consider themselves Caribbean. The Caribbean can be defined, we say geographically, but it must also be understood historically, socio-politically, and even psychologically. We made the point that when we study societies, and this is Caribbean thought, which involves the study of societies. When we do so, we say that we ask the question, in whose interest? Very important. We ask the question, in whose interest? And we said that it's very important to ask that question because often the creators act in the interest of class, okay? In the interest of a class, of a people, or of a foreign colonial power, as in the case of the Caribbean. We also made the point that Ian Meeks and Norman Girvan argued in the Caribbean Reader that the Caribbean is an invention. We also said that is that true? We asked the question, is it true that the Caribbean is an invention? And we said that, and I'm saying to you, in my estimation, it sounds and seems to be true on the face of it, if we were to push it to its logical end. Because the Caribbean is shaped through European eyes. I mean, in a sense, before Christopher Columbus came here in 1492, would the Caribbean look like what it is today before Christopher Columbus' arrival? Economically, we know the Caribbean is often described as a dependent capitalist economy, And we say that it's dependent because the Caribbean is heavily reliant on foreign aid and trade, okay? Heavily dependent on foreign aid and foreign investment. So there it is. The Caribbean is an invention. Next, we said that. The next one we want to talk about is we want to define structural adjustment. We talk about the Caribbean being an invention of the 21st century. The Caribbean is made to be a dependent capitalist country. Heavily dependent on international investments and foreign aid. And whatever investments and whatever monies are made, if it's not sent overseas, then whatever is left, it is distributed through the dominant class. Of course, we talk about, so that's important to note. Ramesh Ram Sawan explains structural adjustment, and in the book, The Challenge of Structural Adjustment in the Commonwealth Caribbean, Ramesh Ram Sawan explains structural adjustment as a process that transfers decision-making power away from the local people to foreigners. In fact, this is what he says. This is what he says in the book. This is what he says in the book, according to Ramesh Ramsawan. He says the structural adjustment issue is not surprisingly one surrounded by intense controversy and emotion. This is because it does not concern simply with economic policies or improving government performance, but brings into question basic economic philosophy and ideology, and may also involve the effective transfer of decision making from local hands. Structural adjustment involves the transfer. Let me read this again, because we're talking about, when we're defining what the Caribbean is, and we said that economically we know the Caribbean is often described as a dependent capitalist economy. As part of this invention, it was always supposed to be dependent. After its independence, it was supposed to be dependent. Okay. And in the 1957, when it looked as if that Jamaica was going to defy the odds, and excel, that was a problem. In 1957, in the 1960s, when GDP was 5, that was a problem. A lot of Caribbean countries doing relatively well, but that's a problem. And so here comes crisis in the 1970s with OPEC. And by then, which we believe it was created, and then by then, you have an opportunity. The Caribbean countries need money. They spend off all the money in the 1950s and 60s. They need money. They go to the international regime to get them, to their competitors to get funding. And of course, what does competitors do? They want to kill the competition. So they lend them money through the IMF, and the IMF was created in 1944. The key institution that was created in 1944, just when they created a new world order after World War II, was the IMF. The international countries, the post-industrial countries, the US and the Germany and the France and the Spain, of course, these powerful countries, you know who wasn't there? The non-aligned countries, the Jamaica, the Barbados, yes? All these, the countries fighting for nationalism, they weren't in there in 1944. So their interests weren't at the table when they were reinventing the world in 1944. And they created the IMF long before we needed the IMF to reconstruct the world, to speed up globalization, but essentially to kill the competition. Because essentially, by the 1970s, 80s, they went to the IMF, the Jamaican, the Caribbean governments went to the IMF, global South countries went to the IMF to get money. The IMF, where the IMF get the money from? The IMF get the money from powerful countries, wealthy countries, from their banks, wealthy people who want to continue to be wealthy. And it's important to maintain global wealth and global dominance, not just within countries, but globally. Global dominance is important. So what has happened is that here it is. They went to the IMF, Michael Manley and Edward Siaga and so on, and PJ Patterson and all the other governments throughout Guyana. And so all of them had the experience throughout the Caribbean, from Suriname to Jamaica to the Leeward Islands, went to the IMF to borrow money. By the time the plan was to lend them the money, the IMF lend them the money, but at exorbitant interest rates and tight conditionalities, but they were promoting it as a kind of philosophy that's supposed to work, and had school of thought created. But school of thought also helped to give rise to strategy that has helped to kill the competition, that has helped to prop up the wealthy few served to prop up the wealth of the few over the many. So Ramesh Ramsawan, in the book, The Challenge of Structural Adjustment in the Commonwealth Caribbean, talks about the idea of structural adjustment, because synonymous with the IMF is the idea of structural adjustment. Structural adjustment was supposed, notice, he redefined it as something else, but because that was the experience of Ramesh and the people within the Caribbean. Structural adjustment was supposed to help reconstruct.
Hello, anybody hearing, sir?
I am hearing.
Was supposed
I'm hearing.
Was supposed to restructure the Caribbean, restructure the world to bring the Caribbean in the global market. Yes, because that was the consensus. That is the Washington consensus. The Washington consensus. If Caribbean countries, Caribbean economies plug themselves in the global economy and facilitate global trade, to liberalize their economy. And of course, when they went to the IMF to get funding in the 90s, late 70s, 80s, and 90s, and so on, the idea was, yes, we'll lend you the money, but we're going to lend you the money to show that, but we're going to lend you the money tied to conditionalities that are good, conditionalities that facilitate globalization, that will for sure turn your local economy into juggernauts, economic powers. But that's not what happened. Structural adjustment did not restructure the Caribbean. It didn't restructure Jamaica or Barbados or Guyana or parts of Africa. It didn't restructure these countries. It changed them. And this is how Ramesh defines structural adjustment. He said, it is not surprisingly one surrounded by intense controversy and emotion. It is an emotion, and you hear I'm talking about it emotionally. It's because it is a controversial thing. Structural adjustment is a controversial topic. When you study the societies of the Caribbean, you're going to meet up with the IMF, and you're going to meet up with the policy of the IMF, which is structural adjustment. Structural adjustment was promoted as the policy that's supposed to facilitate globalization, neoliberal globalization. Okay, globalization that was supposed to be the sine qua non of development, the ideal of economic development that was supposed to transform economies and these independent countries, newly independent countries, into powerhouses, into post-industrial economies. But that they were speaking from out of the side of their mouths. They were being pharisaical because they were telling the Caribbean people to restructure their economies. But the Caribbean was not at the place to restructure their economies. They weren't ready to restructure their economies because they are just developing independence. And we're going to show you the handout in a few minutes that shows you the timeline of the Caribbean. But they were restructuring the Caribbean. So the structural adjustment did not help the Caribbean. And that's the idea of neoliberalism. Structural adjustment caused them to open up their economies, but that did not do anything. And there's something I want to share. We talk about when you study society, you study in whose interest. And one of the things you study is strategy. So here it is that the Washington consensus, the idea of liberalizing your economies, of removing trade barriers to facilitate trade, was supposed to be a two-way street. Removing investing in local manufacturing, because if you do that, then you're gonna create unfair competition, because then you're gonna put your manufacturers at an advantage to export at low rates and so on. So that was, but guess what? So therefore, that was part of the idea of structural adjustment and neoliberal globalization. But the problem with that is that the Caribbean was fledgling and new and was not ready to take on, but they had to plug themselves into an idea that was not necessarily the ideal for the Caribbean. It was a strategy for the post-industrial countries for this, to help to maintain their advantages and their economic power. And what structural adjustment ultimately did was, according to Ramesh Ramsawan, he says it simply did not concern itself with economic policies of improving government performance. Structural adjustment did not had nothing to do with improving government performance, but brings into question basic economic policy and ideology, and involves the effective transfer of decision making from local hands. Note, it involves what? It involves structural adjustment. That whole charade with the IMF and the government of the 1970s and 80s and so on involves transferring power. So that's all that happened after the and that's the irony of independence. So after all these countries got independence in the 1960s, and hopefully you guys have the handout, and you're probably looking at the handout. And if you look at the handle where it says the 90s, but after these countries got independence, what you have, globalization is happening. They're speeding towards globalization. And by the time globalization happened, that's the irony. That's the irony of what happened. Because when in 1955, when the non-aligned countries had the Bandung Conference, where all these countries was fighting for revolution and for independence, and they came together, Jamaica and Guyana and so on, and all these countries came together to advocate for independence. Algeria, you ever heard about the Algerian War of the Algerian War of Revolution and so on? All these countries they came together for the Bandung Conference. Just as though in 1944, the post-industrial countries, the global North countries came together. Well, by 1955, there was a war. The nationalists' war was happening in the 1950s, leading up to, and by 1960s, a lot of countries got independence. But the independence suited the new world order that they were already planned. That was in motion. A new world order was already in motion. So here it is. The irony is that all these countries in the 55 was fighting for independence. 1960s, 70s, they got independence. But by the time they got their independence, and what dogged them is that they fought for a national independence, they didn't fight for an independence where they can come together and fight as one. But all the nationalists wanted their own nations. And by the time we get to the 70s and the 80s, when we wanted a strong union of all these independent nations, they were all going it alone. Just as how Jamaica got independence in 1960s and snub the West Indian Federation prior to that. Because they were talking about the West Indian Federation before all these other islands were talking about an independence. But the nationalists wanted to struck their own egos and go it alone. This going it alone has also affected Caribbean unity. This going it alone has also affected Caribbean response to the future, to what has happened in the 1970s and 80s and 90s. Because the kind of Caribbean we wanted wasn't necessarily a Caribbean independence, for Jamaica to be independent, for Guyana to be independent, for Barbados to be independent. And today, the Caribbean continue to have a kind of independence that is not an integrate, that does not rely on that Caribbean unity to help to withstand their vulnerability and international threats. So that has been part of the issue, part of the problem. So part of the issue was for the Caribbean to maintain their backwardness. They got their independence, but for them to maintain their backwardness, the Caribbean was not supposed to provide a credible and an effective competition to the post-industrial countries. So the policies of the IMF, the policy of structural adjustment, was never to reshape the Caribbean into strong juggernauts, economic powers, but to keep them dependent, to keep them dependent economies. And that's the idea of structural adjustment, in the sense, or the irony of structural adjustment. And that is what Ramesh Ramsaran is trying to point out in the Trinidadian is trying to point out in his book, The Challenge of Structural Adjustment. The challenge, is it a challenge? Because structural adjustment was supposed to be the hope for the Caribbean. And that is what I talk about in the book Neoliberalism. Okay? And I go more deeper in the book Neoliberalism to unearth some of these things.
So,
now,
sir,
yeah, go ahead.
it is colonization in a different form.
In terms of what?
Why I say that? Because just as how we were brought here as slaves to serve them, even though we have been independent, we are still serving them in some sort of way because we are not united. We're not seeing that we need to come together and be as one. So we're still under them. We're following their rules. When we borrow their money, we can't do certain things. They tie us. So we're functioning in their sphere, so to speak.
No, that's a good point. Yes, that's always the idea. And we inherit their institutions to ensure that that continues. They don't need to be here or there or anywhere because of what we of the inheritance, and that is what Frantz Fanon, when he talks about we need to rewrite the history of man. The Caribbean must begin a new history of man as tabula rasas, as blank slate. That's what he was talking about. Because I said to you, the Caribbean is not supposed to rival the US. It's not supposed to rival the UK. It's not supposed to compete effectively against these superpowers. When that happens, they pass an embargo, like what they've done with Venezuela. Very important. Now, as it relates to we once called these countries the third world, just so you know. We once called these countries the third world. And if I ask you what the global south is, the global south are countries that were once referred to as third world, but we want to be politically correct. Okay? We want to be politically correct. And language is very important. People evolve. So we have to be careful in terms of what we say and how we use language. So we used to say third world and first world. We don't say third world and first world anymore, because first world and third world, who was third world? Who was always third world? The developing world, which is always the Caribbean, which is always the African countries and so on, and former colonized countries, was always seen as third world. And language is important. It suggests backwardness. It suggests secondary. So of course, we no longer say third world because language is important. So we say global south, yes? And we say emerging markets because places like Jamaica, Argentina, these are called our emerging markets. So if I were to ask you in the exam, what is the third world? I mean, what is the global south? The global south are simply countries that were once called developing countries that we now use the term global south to refer to them. Okay, so as to correct language, because third world would originally suggest backwardness and lack. Okay, but so therefore we correct that. So we don't say third anymore, we say global south and global north. Okay, that's very important to note that. And it's very important to put these terms into perspective. The next thing that in terms of key terms, Jamaica and many of the Caribbean countries remain developing, even as some people flirt with emerging markets. And I want to make that point. Jamaica and many Caribbean countries remain developing, and although many of them are flirting with emerging markets. So in Mexico, which is not Caribbean, it's part of the Americas though, but it was said to be a developing country, but it's no longer developing. It's more actually Mexico is making cars now. Jamaica, I think Jamaica is more considered an emerging market, not necessarily developing. Poverty has been slashed in half, and they're doing well in Jamaica, relatively speaking. So that's good. But they're still the thing is, Jamaica is still vulnerable. The Caribbean is still vulnerable because of where they are and their position in the world, and because of the lack of capital-intensive capabilities, which they need to invest in. But the Caribbean may never fully recover from a past marred in colonization, unfair competition, and systemic sabotage. And I'm going to talk about that. Again, the Caribbean may never fully recover from the past, marred by colonization, unfair competition, and systemic sabotage. Now, having said that, where do we begin? The question is, where do we begin? And I'm going to play a video where we talk about the root of the Caribbean problem: race, class, and the Black position. Again, where do we begin? and the root of the Caribbean problem: race, class, and the black position. And of course, we say that the core problem of the Caribbean mirrors problems across the globe in spaces dominated by people of African, Indian, or brown descent. In one of the class I said some time ago, I said, wherever you find black or brown people, you often find lack. Wherever you find black and brown people, you often find lack. And I've said that to you guys, and I've said that to some of the students here at JTS. Wherever you find black and brown people, you find lack. And of course, Africologists.
You find what, sir?
You find lack wherever you are you find black and brown people. It's as if there's a conspiracy against those spaces that is predominantly occupied by black and brown people.
I agree, sir. I agree.
And by the way, when we talk about colonization, and I want to define colonization, colonization is not just a period. It is a process of depersonalization. Okay? It is a process of depersonalization. And Frantz Fanon, in his book, Wretched of the Earth, talks about that. So if you guys are writing, make a note of that. Colonization is what? It is not just a period of control where Europe dominated and controlled much of the world, stemming from the transatlantic in the mid 1500s to 1600s, starting. Okay, I'm not just talking. So it's not just a period. Colonization, it is a process of control that involves the depersonalization of a people. It involves stripping away of a people's humanity. That is what they did with slaves. Oh, sorry, with the African that they brought here. They redefined them as something, as property, as objects, as cattle, as simpletons, with people with no brain, no religion. Whenever you find black and brown people, you often find lack, and they have made it so. And of course, Africologists argue that the root issue is the black position, a social and psychological construction. Black, the word black is created. We are molded into or made into black people, a label rooted in a logic that associate blackness with evil, lack, or inferiority. Nothing black no good. African people are black. Therefore, African people who are black no good. This is not accidental. It is the intentional logic of colonization. Colonization, that is the intentional. That's why some people don't like to call themselves black. Okay? But it is not accidental or ironic. Yet it is ironic, but it is not ironic. It is the intentional logic of colonization. The intentional logic of colonization. Colonization, we say, is a process of depersonalization, a stripping away of agency and humanity. It strips away agency and humanity. And I want you to hear what I'm about to say, guys, because this is deep. It creates a malady where people act against their best interests.
Agreed, sir.
What is agency? Agency is not necessarily institution. Agency also involves, and you can write this down, and when you go, and if you were ever to study, but in humanities or in Africology or in studies of this nature, you have to study agency. As Caribbean, you are doing guidance and counseling, you're doing theology, you're doing social work, and so on and so forth, social science. Agency is a powerful term. And people always say, oh, we have to help our people to develop agency. Or vulnerable people in community lack agency. They lack people who can advocate for them. Okay? And that's, as social workers, as guidance and coach, that's your job, is to help to develop agency, or help to work with people so that they develop agency, have agency, or reach to a place of agency. That involves, okay, and as people in the helping profession, you are working with a wide cross section of people. So therefore, the idea of agency is important, and African people's agency have been thwarted, have been and the word, I'm trying to find the word, African people's agency have been strategically maligned, corrupted. And that is why in many Black and brown African communities, there is so much contention and strife because many in communities, they still struggle with identity issues. And many people don't think that they're struggling with identity issues because they don't use the bleaching cream. They think that it's only people that use bleaching cream struggle with the issue of identity within the Caribbean, or within a Caribbean or a space that was colonized and colonized, and just as colonization. It does not. Colonization does not only involve using the bleaching cream, but because it involves an issue of identity. But colonization also involves, and by the way, we talk about that colonization. Sorry, post-colonialism is the lingering effects of the historical damages done to the African or people of African descent within the Caribbean. That's post-colonial, okay? And the damage that is done to him is replicated or finds or shows up in many different ways, in many different abnormalities, they say. And in some people, and of course we talk about the issue of the bleaching cream. People are changing their
Sir, sorry to stop you, but can I have you define agency for me in your term?
Agency
in my term, yes.
Thank you. I'm going to get to that. But the idea here, yes, as I was saying, not just that in terms of the bleaching cream, but a denial of their traditions. Because the bleaching cream, where they're trying to look like their master or the foreigner, I will define that for you in a second. The issue of agency, not within what it is in terms. Okay, we'll define it in a second. But also, not just bleaching themselves, but the denial of their traditions, to the extent where they embrace other traditions to become and act and preach and sing like those traditions. So there are those people, like Jerome might say, that in essence we are doing that too. There are those who would argue that just as though in one sense we look at those people who bleach their skin. There are those Rastafarians who look at some Christians that say, you're not bleaching your biological skin, but you're bleaching your spiritual skin, or your brain, or your spirituality, because you're draining yourself of anything African, and you are embracing, and you're in a sense, it's a bleaching, and embracing a kind of a spiritual experience that is foreign to the African or people of African descent. I'm just saying that could be the argument that one could provide. Yeah. When we talk about agency involves the ability of one to act in his own self-interest. The ability of one to act in his or her self-interest. The ability to act for and in one's own self-interest. Yes? That is agency. That the ability to act in one's own self-interest. The ability to act towards one's self-improvement, one's betterment. Now, there are those persons that, and we shared an example. We talk about that in terms of developing a kind of African consciousness, or kind of consciousness, whereby people of African descent understand what it means to be truly African, because our understanding of what it means to be truly African as people within the African diaspora has been bastardized, has been manipulated, has been made to be something that it is not, because of who is writing the history, who is telling the story. And of course, we talk about, why would you want Haiti to rival the US? Why would you want Cuba to rival the status quo? Why would they want Jamaica to do very well? Jamaica must do well, but not well enough. Not well enough. That's why we will always have an immigration problem. Okay, Jamaica is not to do well enough. But the agency is the ability to act in one's own self-interest, which many people believe that Africans or people in certain communities don't act in. People in African communities, people in the Philadelphia, in the Nannyville, in the Denham town. There's in terms of the ability to develop, or the lacking of agency. People act. They're saying persons act in certain ways because of the consciousness about what it means to be a thing, or to be a person, what it is to be a black man in Nannyville or in Philadelphia, what it is. Okay, what is your, now say for example, what it is. I was in Philadelphia when I just came here, and I wanted to dispose of my garbage in the garbage can. One young man said to me, "What are you doing? You're dumb. Throw away that, man. You act like you're nice. You act like you're black or what? You're black or what?" For him, to be black is to be a nigger. To be African is to be a nigger. To be black, and it means, no, you don't throw throw your garbage into a receptacle. You throw it in the floor, man. Take your trash and throw it outside. You don't. If you do gardening, wow, he's doing gardening. Wow, that's what certain people do. Gardening. Is that a white neighborhood, or is he in Barbican? People not even gonna do that. What am I do? But him I put up garden in front of him, yeah, them funny. You don't do that, But when those ways are what we think. Or why is it that he has that kind of family? Black people don't have that kind of no. That's the idea of agency it comes from a consciousness. A consciousness is a consciousness that says certain people are not supposed to behave in certain ways that better themselves, or that improve themselves, or so on and so forth. So agency suggests, and according to Africologists, the problem is that because the idea of being black, the idea of blackness, the idea of blackness has been created within colonization, helps to suggest ideas about the black man, about the black woman or the African. That is not necessarily true. If anything, the African had family. If anything, the African had a sense of duty and ancestry and prayer. If anything, the African, and so in a sense, we are redefining and re-understanding what it means to be African, so that now we can let our children and grandchildren understand what it truly means to be African. It really means it. And so we want to start from that place. But colonization has stripped that away. Okay, and colonization is a process of depersonalization, a stripping away of agency and humanity. It creates malady, where people act against their best interests. Talicia.
All right, Telika, sir. So, you said anything black is not good. I don't know. I'm gonna go a little bit back. Have you ever heard this phrase? Because I've heard it coming from all the way from the sons of Noah, the one that was said to have looked at his father's nakedness. It said that he was black. And so it's perpetuating all the way from that, and this is how far it's actually coming from that's coming down. And so, because Canaan, according to the school of thought that came, which is the grandson, was white, then it was blamed on to say because of what he did, then this is what happened. So you see all of the colonization that has taken place is as if it's saying, all right, they are dumping back everything back on us. I
Well,
don't
I
know
mean,
if you
but
have ever heard that before.
that's an exegetical issue. You are creating a perspective, an exegesis. You create an exeget. You know, your approach to scripture is negative, and so they're reading into scripture to say that the exchange that took place suggests the negative side of blackness, yes, or the African, but that's not necessarily true. Okay, that is a perspective, and please remember that the Bible is written within the context of a culture that thought that it was better than other cultures and other peoples. Yes, who is next? Franz Fanon says colonization is not only physical, it is it is not only physical, it is psychological violence. Franz Fanon, who wrote, and I have the book here, Wretched of the Earth. And by the way, somebody talk about W.E.B. Du Bois, and I actually have the books here by W.E.B. Du Bois, Dark Waters from Within the Veil. And he also wrote the book, The Souls of Black Folk, W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois went to the school I went to. He went to University of Penn, and he was a professor at University of Penn. He's not alive. He's dead now, of course. He's a historical figure. But one of the first black men but he looked very Caucasian. And I said, but W.E.B. Du Bois says in The Souls of Black Folk that he describes the idea of the blackness. He looks at the black man, and he describes or blackness, or the problem of blackness, and he describes it as within a veil. He says, how do we think of ourselves? How do we think of ourselves? Because, W.E.B. Du Bois in Souls of Black Folk describes the problem of the colonized today as within a veil, in terms of how he comes to terms with his identity, the black man, the black woman, or the African, wherever you are, the African within the diaspora. The tension between how we see ourselves and how the dominant society sees us. W.E.B. Du Bois, in Souls of Black Folk, describes this issue of the depersonalization and what has come of it to today. Because Franz Fanon is writing in the 1940s, 1950s. And he's writing within that same frame, within that same period, W.E.B. Du Bois, 60s, 70s. But he's talking about the problem of blackness, quote unquote, and the issue of identity, black identity, the tension between how we see ourselves and how the dominant society sees us. That also involves matters of religion, matters of sex, matters of culture, matters of all of that. Am I out of the veil, or am I still within the veil? Am I talking about The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois? Talking about how do we see ourselves? Am I out of the veil? So he talks about this veil. There is this, like, as if society has a veil, or when we think of ourselves, we always think about ourselves as within a veil. When you think of your identity, when you think of yourself, when you come in contact with the other, how do you see, if you were to ever think of yourself in society in terms of one, of course, and the question is, how do you think of yourself? Am I out of the veil, or am I within the veil? And by that I mean, am I accepted by the white person? Am I not accepted by the white person? Or have I fully Have I fully assimilated to the norms and values? How well do I speak the British English? How well do I live, preach, sing, and act? Do I act European enough without thinking that I act European or what? And what institutions are there to help maintain this lifestyle that was foreign but has been colonized to become part of my identity and my experience? And is colonization part of faith? Is our faith also colonized? And what pertains before that? How well do I speak? How well am I accepted? Who is God then? Is it the colonizers' reflections about me and their impositions and influences? Or is it the reality of God himself who have found unique ways to relate to man directly without man having to feel as though how God has related to him is subservient to another man's revelation or inspiration of God to that man? Because obviously God revealed himself to the African. Because if we say that Obia is evil, it's as if we're saying that God can't reveal himself to African and the African express it in the ways in which God has worked it out for him to express it. While at the same time, he has revealed himself to the European and he has expressed it within a particular way. Okay, but we have chosen to accept as normative and as valuable and credible an experience that is antithetical to our identity. And always asking, am I out of the veil or am I within the veil or am I out of the veil? You know, when people get into certain, Homi Bhabha talks about she's from India, but when she got in, she was a Rhodes Scholar when she went to Britain, because you know Britain was also, India was colonized by Britain, and a lot of cultures, you know, when you go to India and so on, it's as if some of the ways, some of the ideas, some of the cultural practices almost similar to Caribbean. They play cricket and soccer or football, sorry, and they speak and the cultures and the food and the curry and so on, almost similar. Anyways, but she talks about how when she went from India, from Bombay, India, in the location of culture, the book Homi Bhabha, Location of Culture, and she went to the UK. She was a Rhodes Scholar, to Cambridge, I think, or Oxford. And she was saying it was the greatest achievement. It was amazing. The greatest achievement you could ever have to be able to do that. You know, and you know, it's the greatest because you have achieved, because now you really get to learn English and to see how English is to be spoken, and you get to it's as if an appreciation, and then when you go back as a hero in a sense. She talks about that and the hypocrisy of that. W.E.B. Du Bois talks about the veil. Am I British enough? Can I speak well enough? And when I talk about well enough, can I speak the language, not Jamaican language, English well enough? What somebody asks you, Jamaican, what do Jamaicans speak? I said, Jamaicans speaking. We speak Patois. We speak Patois, yeah, we do speak Patois, but we also speak English. But we speak but Patois is not a dialect. I often say to people, Patois is not a dialect. It is a language, because Patois and all these African and Caribbean Black people languages, they're not language, they're dialect. They're considered dialect. It shows how valuable your culture is, what you find valuable. Your religion is not valuable. Your language, they call it a dialect. That's just why Louise Bennett Coverley did everything in her power to lift up the dialect. Yes, to raise it, to raise it to a level that was toe to toe with any other language, in a sense. Symbiotic with any other language. Raise it to that level. Homie Baba talks about the center and the periphery. But these are important points I'm making. Toni Morrison reminds us that you can try to be white. So am I British enough? Am I white enough? You know, Toni Morrison reminds us that you can try to be white, but you can never be white enough. You can try to be British, but you can never be British enough. So we live with internal contradiction, pursuing an identity baptized by the colonizer. But Toni Morrison, she wrote a book. Toni Morrison wrote this book. Wasn't Go Tell It on the Mountain. I just mentioned the book earlier. Toni Morrison, God Save the Child. God Save the Child. She's an anthropologist and she's a literary genius. She wrote the book God Save the Child. And she talks in the book, she shares an exchange between this woman and a white slave. And this white slave woman, white colonizer was talking to this, having an exchange with this other person on the train. And this person thinking that he is white was looked down upon by the very same white person who approached him or her saying, "Who are you?" But because he or she answered in such a way that seemed to have exhibited more whiteness than the white man himself, he was killed on the train. You can be white, but you can be. If you're too white, that's a problem. But you cannot be black. That's a problem too. That's the world we live in. And there is a malady within ourselves that has been created. You don't accept your language. You accept, if you do, it's secondary. We look down on those people who speak less than us or can't speak, a certain way or think a certain way. Interesting. Let's go to the next point. Yeah, go ahead. Question.
Word says that he's not man that he should lie, the son of man, that he should apologize. What he says is, yeah.
Who is that? Hello? Jerome?
Yeah, that was that answer.
What's going on?
My mic unmuted.
Somebody is talking.
Is Jerome, his mic accidentally unmute.
Okay.
And there's noise in his background.
All right. So, okay. You're at church, Jerome?
So excuse me, may I be excused for about 5 minutes the most thing, please?
All right. So what? Okay, fine. It's 9:32. We're going to take a 10-minute break. When we come back, we're going to look at the difference between Afrocentrism and Eurocentrism. We'll continue from we'll pick up from where we are. What is Afrocentrism as against Eurocentrism? And then we are going to start watching the video by Ivan Van Satima. It's going to be a 30-minute video. So when we come back, we'll watch it towards the last half of the class. So we are going to give you you're going to take a break now. You come back at 9:42. Okay?
So, sir, when we come back at 9:42, how long are we going to stay? 15 minutes?
I'm sorry, that's 8:42 for us, yeah?
Yeah, I understand, but we're in the last half of the class already. That's why I'm asking.
Wait, what time is it now?
By our time, it's 8:32, 33 now, sir.
And the class finishes at 10 o'clock. All right. So
9 o'clock, sir. We have half an hour remaining.
All right.
His timing, baby girl. Remember, his timing from Earth.
Sorry, I am yeah. Oh, you know what? Well, we don't have any time to break. We'll just
exactly.
don't have any time.
Let's go straight into it, sir.
Let's go straight into it. All right. What I'm going to do? There's much more to talk about, but we're going to stop here because I want to talk about Afrocentrism as against Eurocentrism. But there's one point I want to make. Afrocentricity says it is one way to see the world. Eurocentricity says it is the only way to see the world. Okay, I'm gonna again. Afrocentricity says it is one way to see the world. Eurocentricity says it is the only way to see the world. Okay? That's a very important point for you guys to know. The next point is, what's the other point I want? I'm going to stop there. Okay, I'm going to share, I'm going to have you guys watch a video. And there is one point I want to make, that dark ghettos exist wherever Black and brown people are. They are political, economic, social colonies, and their peoples are victims of greed, cruelty, fear, guilt of their masters. Now, the idea of internal ghetto, we'll pick up that later on. But right now, I'm going to share a video which I've been trying to share with you from last week. It's not Life and Death. It is by Ivan Van Sertima. Ivan Van Sertima, he's 6 years ago. He says 6 years ago, during my first brief visit to America, I came across three volumes in the private library of a Princeton professor. They had been published half a century ago, and their title fascinated me: Africa and the Discovery of America. Please remember that when the Caribbean is part of that discovery. The Caribbean is part of the Americas. They represented a lifetime of dedicated scholarship by a Harvard linguist, Leo Wiener. Professor Wiener had been working on a grammar of American languages in the early years of this century when he stumbled upon a body of linguistic phenomena that indicated clearly to him the presence of an African and Arabic influence on some medieval American and South American languages before the European came to the Americas. So it was quite, when I learned that, I said, I found an interview with Ivan Van Sertima talking about the discovery. And that's where we'll begin to this part of the class, and we'll wrap up with this part of the class. Because as we begin to look at I sent you guys a timeline of the Caribbean. And the timeline of the Caribbean is very important that you, let me see if I could bring that up. I talk about the fact that Caribbean sailors, they were African people were here in the Caribbean before the Europeans. That is major. Now, we're not talking from off the top of our heads. We have real proof and we have real evidence of it. And today I want to spend some time to share that with you. If I could bring it up here.
Good evening. Ask any youngster, or any adult for that matter, when did Africans first come to America? And the answer will be in 1619 as indentured servants. Well, that answer is no longer valid, according to Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, author of They Came Before Columbus. Dr. Van Sertima, an anthropologist and historian, is a graduate of London University and Rutgers Graduate School of Anthropology. He is also a literary critic and has been honored by the Nobel Committee of the Swedish Academy by being asked to nominate candidates for the Nobel Prize in Literature for the past 5 years. Currently, he is professor of African Studies at Rutgers University. Dr. Van Sertima, up until relatively recently, what had scholars been saying about Africans in the pre-Columbus period in the Americas?
Well, there is a very profound distortion of African history. Almost all of the books that have been written on Africa have been studies of primitives, of people in small communities just barely scratching the soil, people in jungles, etc. There is no, after the conquest, or just around the time of the conquest and after, you have a tremendous breaking up of African societies. It's not just a question of tearing these people out of their country, throwing them across the Atlantic as slaves, but the smashing of many things. It's as if you had dropped several hydrogen bombs on Africa. So that what you see afterwards is just the remnants, the ruins of the worst in Africa. The African, therefore, the image of the African ancestor has been built up upon the lowest common denominator. When we go back to European history, European heritage, we always go back to its great heroes, its magnificent achievements. But when we go back into Africa, historians and anthropologists have always looked for the worst. when in fact you begin to study African history seriously, and recent archaeological discoveries have now throwing up remarkable things. They found within recent years, for example, that the Africans were producing steel in Tanzania, East Africa, 1,500 years before the Europeans. That they had not only entered the age of iron before Europe, but they had jumped into the age of steel. Now, what has happened to this? If you go back into Tanzania today, you cannot find this. You cannot find that kind of development. Therefore, you begin to be aware that colonization, the conquest of Europe, didn't drag people up. It actually smashed things that were happening there. Now these things are coming out of the earth because archaeology is beginning to recover these things. African history cannot be recovered, and even American history, early history, cannot be recovered like European history, because Europe has had the advantage after the conquest of having about 5 centuries of fairly settled history. They can go to their libraries, etc., in spite of the wars. But in Africa, the library is in the ground. The record of what has happened, the broken record lies there. Now they're finding astronomical observatories. 2 years ago, they found that the Africans were involved in the most complex astronomy, that they had plotted a whole star system. This is in Kenya, at Namorotunga. They found among the Dogon in West Africa that Africans had plotted an invisible star 700 years before it was discovered by European astronomers in the 20th century, and that the plotting of the orbit and trajectory of this star, which is a white dwarf, an invisible star, Sirius B, the trajectory and plotting, the plotting of the orbits and trajectories are as accurate as that done by satellites in the 20th century. Recently, yesterday in fact, just before I came here, the New York Times brought out a startling article showing that the Africans had entered the domestication of cattle in East Africa 7,000 years before it occurred anywhere else in the world. And this is one of the bases. This is one of the bases of civilization. So that you have to look again at the African. It is because the capacity of the African, the potential of the African, has been reduced in our imagination and our consciousness by these studies of primitives, that we do not realize that the African was involved in things that are just as important, just as significant, and in some areas even more significant than what was happening in Europe before the Industrial Revolution.
What is the main idea in your book, They Came Before Columbus?
The main idea in my book is to show that early America, America before the coming of Columbus, was a far more complex society than people imagined, and that it involved Africans. Africans came in here. They came in on several occasions. Sometimes these were accidents, sometimes they were on purpose, and that they had an influence, an actual impact and influence upon the formation of certain American civilizations.
When we say pre-Columbus period, what are we talking about?
We're talking about long before 1492. It is absurd, and only fools can still believe that Columbus discovered the Americas in 1492. In fact, Columbus never even came to this continent. Columbus wandered about in the Caribbean islands just on the very edge of the great civilizations. Cortez came here in 1519, and he entered Mexico. And Mexico, when I speak of Mexico in this program, do not confuse it simply with the Mexico we know today. That was a center of a civilization that spread over a great part of this continent. That, when Cortez entered, he had come out of the heart of Europe, and he said when he entered Native America, when he entered Mexico, and he saw the pyramids and the palaces and the floating gardens and the zoos and the aqueducts and the running baths, he says, I have not seen its like in Europe.
So the main idea in your book, you were dealing with that initially.
The main idea in my book is that there were visits to this continent from the old world, that there were visits to the Native Americans in this continent, and those visits included Africans. And 2 of the visits of Africans were major and significant, and they affected American civilization. And American civilization was far more complex, far more advanced than was formerly believed. Earth satellites a few months ago revealed that the Native Americans, long before the coming of Europeans, had the most intricate network of irrigation canals ever discovered in agriculture.
So what? I just lose this $200,000 in commission because of what? Communication? No, you lost because of.
Okay, let us clear up one thing before we go any further. In the book that came before Columbus, you used the terms Negro Nubian, Negro Egyptian. Why?
Well, that in some ways is unfortunate. I found it necessary to use the word Negro. I no longer use it. I'm now the editor of the Journal of African Civilizations, and I use the word Africoid for African types, skulls, etc. The reason why I was forced to use the word I had been trained in European.
Sorry if you're hearing you pause the video.
Sorry about that. I was talking. Yes, I was saying very important point that he's making. He makes the point about what was going on in America when Columbus came. He said when Christopher Columbus, when the Europeans came here in the 1400s, when they came to the Americas, which includes the Caribbean, okay, because the American Indians that were living here, they involved the Caribs, the Arawaks, the Taino people. They were all traversing across the Americas because the type of people, they were nomadic, okay, and they move when the seasons move. They move when the wind moves. That was their economic. That was the economic system. When they have utilized all the subsistence or the land in this area, then they move to another area. Then they move through along and they come back to it. So there was movement along the coast, but again, they were nomadic. They were a people, not that never had borders, that never had nation states like Europeans did. Okay, their idea of how they operate, how they lived in commune, they lived in group, and they traveled together as peoples. Okay, and so the American Indians and the Taino people here, they would move from place to place, travel from place to place within their communes. But he makes a very important point about, and he's saying that the American Indians that were here, they were advanced. They were far more advanced than what the Europeans gave them credit for. But why would they give them credit? Just as though what we know of Egypt today is not Egypt. Yes, it's not what Egypt was. What we know of Egypt today, what we know about Egypt yesterday is not what Egypt was yesterday. Now we have to unlearn and relearn. What we know about Africa today is not what we know about. And what we know about, because where do we learn that from? Where is the information coming from? That is why critical thinking is important to the study of Caribbean thought. That is why when you do Caribbean thought, part of it involves doing critical thinking. Critical thinking is important. Okay, what we know about Haiti and DR is not necessarily the truth, because there was a plan to create a wedge between DR and Haiti that has served the interests of the Spanish, okay, of the Spanish, because they wanted to retake Haiti after they got their independence. They wanted to retake Haiti and retake Hispaniola. So there is always a narrative. But we have to be suspicious and be careful about these narratives. So it was important to tell a history because Eurocentricity believes that it is always right. Eurocentricity promotes ethnocentrism. Eurocentricity promotes a worldview that promotes Occidentalism, yes, or Orientalism. Very important. Ethnicity, okay, it's on European, what? The Europeans know what's best for the Egyptians. The European knows what's best for the Africans, or what's best for the colonists. Or the Europeans know what's best for the natives. But or Africa didn't discover anything. Caribbean people and black people don't discover everything. If they do discover, it's because they were educated or influenced by Europeanism. That is the idea and the exceptional nature of Eurocentricity. So that is the idea. Nothing American or Caribbean was far more advanced than what the Europeans gave them credit for. But the question is, why were they more advanced than what they gave them credit for? Because before Columbus came, the Africans came. And the Africans, and he talks about what the Africans were doing. They were building steel. They were doing years before the Europeans started to do it. And then they came to the Caribbean and sharing their knowledge and living amongst those people. That is why in some places, say for example, some Europeans came and couldn't dominate some countries because they were that powerful. Like, how is it that some Europeans came and they could not take some places, and the countries were they were so primitive in these places? How is it that they couldn't take the Maroons and they were so primitive in these places? Anyways, let's continue with the video.
Now, anthropology and archaeology. All the books I had read used this term, not necessarily with the social implications which it has here. They use this term to separate Africoid types of people from Caucasoids or Mongoloid types, Asiatic and European types. Also, it is a word that has entered neutrally, without any social significance, in the languages of many people who do not have the same kind of prejudices as people in the Anglo-American and some of the Western nations who became colonial powers. Like in some languages in Europe, they use the term Niger, simply meaning black, without any of those connotations. Furthermore, the problem lay in that the word black could not always be used, because if you spoke of a black god, it may not be an African. You can have a black god who is not an African. Tezcatlipoca, for example, is a Native American god who is black, but he's not African. But there is a god, Nawalpili, who is both black and African. He's not only black in a ritual or symbolic sense, but he has Africoid features. So that was the problem I faced. And I had to make those connections, because when people talked of Nubians, they didn't often realize they were talking about black people.
In the first few pages of They Came Before Columbus, you write about when Columbus himself heard about about Africans, the possibility of Africans having been here years before. What about that?
Yes, so Columbus is the first man to give historical witness and evidence of Africans in America before him. In his journals, in his letters, you have evidence of this. He mentioned that when he came back from his first voyage, he went to see the Portuguese. He didn't actually go there on purpose. A storm drew him into Lisbon, Portugal. He'd been sent out by the Spanish. The Portuguese invited him to the court, and there he learned from the Portuguese, who were moving across Africa, who had set up the first fort among Europeans in Africa, that African sailors had actually crossed over the Western Ocean and had found a land mass in the south. This was not what Columbus had found. Columbus found islands, which are now known as the Caribbean islands, but he had not gone on to a continental mass. The Africans had found the actual continental mass. And the Portuguese insisted that this continental mass in the south was 370 leagues, which is about 15 to 1600 miles away, according to whether you count a league as 4 or 4.5. There were differences in counting of a league, but it was about 1500 to 1600 miles away from Africa. And they pointed this out. And Columbus went back to Spain and he insisted, because the Portuguese promised to help him, he insisted that they should draw a line across the world and that this line should be drawn 370 leagues away from the Cape Verde Islands across Africa, and that Spain would claim lands he had found on the other side, and if Portuguese found land within that line on the other side, they could claim it. And Brazil, which was visited by the Africans, was on the other side of the line. And this line was drawn in 1494. It was drawn up in June 1494, before any Europeans had come to South America, on the basis of African knowledge.
Okay, let's get down to the crux of the matter. How did these Africans come to the New World?
Okay, now one of the things, as I have pointed out, in the metallurgy, like the steel, etc., in astronomy, etc., there is a profound misunderstanding of African capacity. The Africans had ships. This is one of them. This is in East Africa. This ship, this is just a model which I found in Fort Mombasa in Kenya. This ship is a 70-tonner. Ships like these in the 13th century before Columbus took elephants to China, right across the Indian Ocean. But this is just, they had ships like this in East Africa before Christ, but there were ships in North Africa along the Mediterranean that were far more sophisticated than any ships the Europeans had. European shipping is not even European. The sail Columbus used comes out of the Arab-African world. The astrolabe comes out of the Arab-African world. They found in the desert before Columbus, in the period before Columbus, the Africans were using compasses and nautical instruments to navigate the desert. They had these instruments which were used to navigate the sea. They've done studies recently of navigation in West Africa showing the Africans did have boats along the Niger. The African had boats that could take 3 camels aboard ship. They had cabins, all of these along the Niger, which opens, if you go down the Senegambia at a certain point, it opens out into the Atlantic. And the Africans did have empires with an Atlantic border.
This is a simple question. It's going to sound simple, but you're talking about black people.
Yes.
Okay.
And on several occasions, Africans were able to make that journey. If you look at a map of currents, and we will look more closely at this later on in the program, you will see there are 3 currents that take you from Africa to America. Africa is half the distance from America as is Europe. Not only is it half the distance, it is far easier to get from Africa to America because the currents take you automatically. In other words, you don't have to know of the existence of America. Even Columbus was not aware of the existence of America. He came off the North Atlantic. Columbus thought he was going to India, and he struck out for the latitude of Japan, hoping to land in India, and he swore he was in India. That is why people like myself are called West Indians. I'm the Indian he found in the West. And Americans are called American Indians because he thought they were in India. So that you have these currents which take you automatically. European ships did not use these currents until the second voyage, when Columbus used that knowledge which he got from the Portuguese about Africans. On the third voyage, on the second voyage, Columbus heard from the American natives in Hispaniola, which is now known as Haiti and San Domingo, that Africans had come to the Native Americans. The Americans told Columbus that. He recorded it in his journals, that Africans had come to them trading in gold-tipped spears. Columbus sent samples of those spears. They were studied, they were surveyed in Spain, and they were found to contain the same ratio of gold, silver, and copper alloys as those found in West African Guinea.
So were these Africans swept along this current?
Yes.
Or did they come purposely?
Initially, it was an accident.
If you're turning 65 or beyond, you're going to want to watch this. There are a lot of people today that are Medicare eligible that are enrolling in Advantage plans because of
Just like initially Columbus's so-called discovery, rather his coming here in a late period, was an accident.
What's the name of this current?
There are several of them.
But I know you guys are finding this quite interesting. The video is 28 minutes long. It has about 10 minutes left, but I don't know. I'm gonna finish it. I don't know if we have time to, and then there are some other reflections I have to say, but I'm gonna send you the handout. You guys can read the handout of some of the stuff, some of the definitions and key terms. Key terms: dark ghetto, African diaspora, people of African descent around the world, Caribbean diaspora, those who left or were displaced from the Caribbean. So those are some definitions you need to know. In neoliberalism, I wrote about the Caribbean immigrant is seen as alien with two sharp teeth and yet must only clean. Why? Because what we can do is feared. What the African do, what the immigrant of Africa, what they can do is feared. Here is this gentleman talking about what the African has done and how they created ships. And Christopher Columbus wrote in his journal that the Africans came earlier and brought gold and gave it to these people in Hispaniola. Quite interesting. Suggests a strong African presence. There's a strong African presence. Recently in the news, if you watch the news, you would have heard them reporting about some 6 immigrants that came to the US from around the world, from Africa, and they said that they walked. And they were like, how were you able to walk? And they said, no, we walked. And they said, yes. And then I think recently there was a big news about that. And then they were showing the map and showing actually people can actually walk. But, you know, wow, I'm telling you, quite interesting. We're going to wrap this up and then we will end class this week. We're going to send the handouts for the remainder of the class, some of the stuff that I didn't get to do. I'll send it to you. And if I have to discuss it later on, we can. But let's finish this. And then next week, I may not be in class. It's going to be a guest lecturer. Be on time. Well, I did tell him, please be on time. Hopefully I'll be here. It's my birthday on Saturday. So Monday I might be away. So I might not be able to make it. But if I can, I'll be here. But be on time. He sent some stuff for you guys to read. Please review it. Please read it. Familiarize yourself with the material as much as possible. But let's just wrap up this quickly.
There's the South Equatorial Current. There's the North Equatorial Current. These currents there's a current coming off the Senegambia coast. There's a current coming off the Cape Verde Islands. There's a current coming up from the southern part of Africa. These currents all move towards South America, into the Caribbean, into the Gulf of Mexico. And there's a return current. And we have evidence that Africans not only went, but in a late pre-Columbian period, they also returned because we found American things which Africans brought back. Just as we have found African things in America, they found American things which Africans brought back with them, such as the cotton in the Cape Verde Islands.
Are these currents still
Oh yes,
still in existence?
For thousands of years, these currents have been in existence. This has been tested. 200 small boats, some of them smaller than the major African boats, have crossed the Atlantic. They have been tested. Thor Heyerdahl, the Norwegian explorer, got Africans to build a ship used long before the birth of Christ, used in Egypt and Ethiopia. And this ship was made of papyrus reed, and the scientists said it couldn't float. And Heyerdahl insisted, and the Africans under Abdullah de Jibrin built the ship, and it crossed the Atlantic successfully to America.
From what part of Africa did these Africans come?
The Africans came at various times from different areas. The one that I want to deal with, because most of the evidence exists for this, is Africans who came out of the Egyptian Nubian world. I'll call it the Egypto-Nubian world, around 800 years before Christ. I'll explain to you how I arrive at that date, how they arrived at that date, and I'll show you the types of evidence. Now, I want you first to look at this head, this stone head.
Okay.
Now, this head, they found a dozen of these heads. They found them in a very specific area. Before we go to the area, look at the head carefully. The lips, the very generous type of lips that you find in the tropical areas, the Africoid type. The broad nose with the very broad, flared type of nostril. and the kind of flattened base, the brow ridge. And look at the helmet. That's a very peculiar type of helmet. It does not occur anywhere else in America. It has a strap along the face, falling along the ear, and it has a circular ear plug. Those helmets, exact type of helmet, were found in the Egyptian world in this period. What period? The period that has been dated by carbon-14 datings. Now, how do they arrive at that datings? They found these heads, and I want to show you the map now so as to show you precisely where the datings were made by scientists.
Okay.
Map carefully. That's the Gulf of Mexico. I want to remind the audience, and I want to make it quite clear that when we're talking about Mexico, we're not just simply talking about Mexico today. This is something that happened 3,000 years ago. That's very recent in history. America was peopled 50,000 years ago across the Bering Straits. This is very recent in American history. The United States is only 200 years old, its boundaries. So do not assume for a moment that we're talking about something outside of the United States. That is a center of civilization that occurred around 1,000 years before Christ. In that specific area, and I want to go back to that map, because in that specific area, I'll show you where they found stone heads. Now you see that thing looking like a basin there. That is the center of the first major American civilization. In that center, and specific points marked by diamonds, you may not be able to see the diamond triangle so easily here, but in that specific area, at Tres Zapotes, at San Lorenzo in Veracruz, and at La Venta, they found a dozen African-type stone heads. Vast heads, 6 to 9 feet high, weighing from 10 to 40 tons. The hugest things ever found in American sculpture, built of pure.
That's it for class for now. But what you guys think so far based on that video you guys watch?
Very interesting, sir, but not surprising. Not surprising to me at all. Because remember that even when you go in the Bible again, it was a black man who helped Jesus. So
No, but
maybe
but what they have, what you see the strategy, they first say that Africans are uneducated, are primitive. Nothing.
Diamond,
Yes.
like
So to hide their influence in the Americas. Yes. It's quite interesting. And that is why the Urban Indian Heritage Society is now saying that in the Americas, there were Africans here. Some of them weren't even brought here. They were already here.
Yeah.
They're saying that they were already here. So many of you who say that, yes, you're from Africa, but yes, you're from, maybe from Africa, but not 10,000 years ago, not 5,000 years ago, not 2,000 years ago, but yeah, maybe 10,000 years ago, maybe 10,000 years ago, but as at 100 years ago, your family was here. Maybe they were, but what he's saying is that many of them, they obviously there was some influence. There was some influence. The Africans had come to the Americas. There was some influence because if you look at the artifacts, you look at what they have, you look at the language, you look at the music, you look at the stone, you look at the carvings, you look at the findings. It has some tremendous similarities. African, that you find the evidence of Africa here. And it's not here because Europeans went there and brought it here. It was already here because the Africans were coming here. That's the first thing we need to understand as we begin to relook at the Caribbean, is to understand that the Caribbean it's more unique and have more history than we think. The Caribbean is said to be an invention, but the Caribbean has more history here than we think of. Okay, it's quite interesting. And I don't think when Norman Girvan and Ian Meeks were writing, when they talk about the Caribbean being an invention, they did not reference Ivan Van Sertima. Okay, We're gonna have we have to end because I don't want you guys to complain. Jerome, you have any bite? Is something important you wanted to say?
Oh, just a little agreement with Telika. To say I'm not surprised because the first known university was in Timbuktu. First known university that excelled in science and astronomy and maths and all of that.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm not surprised.
Right. So you're not surprised, but what we are surprised is their connection, their influence in the Americas. Yes. And that they were settling here before the Europeans. Yes. No, that was part. So, but first we have to go back. We have to remind ourselves about history. We have to remind ourselves that the Africans weren't stupid. In fact, they were sophisticated and gave the world civilization. One. And two, that's the very first thing we need to know. So that now, if these Africans, if we are talking so highly of the Africans, that means they have tradition, they have religion, and many of them have these traditions that we look down upon. Yes? If you know that, Telika and Jerome, would you also agree that if their experience predate all that, then how is it that here it is now we are looking down on the African traditions? Quite interesting. Now there's some stuff I wanted to do that I didn't get to do with you guys. That Kenneth Clark. I wanted to talk about Kenneth Clark, but go to JTS module, and you will see that on JTS module, where I talk about internal ghettos. I don't have time to talk about the internal ghettos and how the ghettos of the post-industrial look just like the ghetto of the Caribbean or the global South. There is so the people in the global South think of themselves as better than the Caribbean diaspora living in the internal ghetto of the North. It's the same. The experiences are the same wherever you are. Once you are black or brown or predominantly black, then that space is supposed to be surveilled. That space is supposed to be controlled. That space is supposed to be dependent. We talk about the internal ghetto. So the colonies of the Caribbean, or the former colonies, which are now post-colonies, which still experience colonization in another sense, those colonies exist in the post-industrial, in the global South. And who lives in these places? The people from the Caribbean diaspora, or people from African descent, that predominantly black or brown or African. That's the point about that ghetto. So the ghetto, they are political, they are economic, they are social colonies. Okay, now they're not just colonies within the Caribbean, but they are colonies wherever you find a certain type of people. Their people are victims of greed, cruelty, fear, and guilt of their masters. That's what Kenneth Clark talk about. He speaks of, and so when you think about Philadelphia, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, and beyond, he names these are both objective conditions. They have housing, mortality, crime, and on the subjective level, resentment, apathy, and despair. So when Kenneth Clark talks about the ghetto of the colonizers or the post-colonial, the ghetto ghetto in Philadelphia, the ghetto in Jamaica and the Caribbean, wherever, it doesn't matter where you are, whether you're in the post-industrial or whether you're in the global South, the global North or the global South. Okay, there is an objective domain, which is housing or crowded housing issues, mortality, high crime, and there's also subjective issues, resentment, apathy, and despair. That's how he defines the issue of colonization or the communities. He says the ghetto is a paradox. It's a dilemma. It's ferment, yet it is also resilient. Lornette talks about the resilience and the indomitability of the people of the Caribbean. That's how she defines it. So the perspective you take. I don't. As long as you don't say Caribbean is a group of islands surrounded by the sea. Okay, but you can say, Lornette said something about the indomitability of the colonized to be able to overcome oppression, yes, and so on, and malady and all of that. So that was you could define that. You could talk about that if we ask you to define Caribbean. Maybe you might want to take a theological perspective. Maybe you want to take a psychological perspective. You approach the perspective, but you want to say, I'm going to take this approach. Okay. Post-colonialism and Fanon, I talk about post-colonialism is not the end of colonization. It is the lingering effects of colonization, the lingering effects of the historical damage done to the people who are victims of colonization. So post-colonialism, again, is not the end of colonization. It suggests that colonization continues today in various forms. In Black Skin, White Mask, Fanon writes, the black man the black man is not any more than the white man. What does he mean? In Black Skin, White Mask, Fanon writes, the black man is no more than the white man. What does he mean by that? The black man is not more than the white man. What does he mean? He means that the black man and the white man are both trapped. The black man is trapped in his inferiority. The white man is trapped in his superiority. The white man has to always have money. He can't be poor. He can't beg. That's a problem for him. The black man must always be begging, must always be poor. But that's a problem. And Fanon, who is a psychologist, talks about that. Freedom is not free. It demands radical transformation. He talks about that in Wretched of the Earth. But I don't have time. I'm rushing, and I don't want to rush. Okay, guys, we'll stop here. We'll pick up some of these concepts, not next week, because next week you have a guest. In the following week, we have another guest, Reverend Richard Beckford will be talking about Caribbean theology. And then the following week after that, I will be back to continue teaching the class. But next week we have a guest, and then the following week we have a guest. But I will be at the class those times, hopefully. That's it for today, guys. We send you the handout. You'll have the handout. You can review some of the handouts that we send. Know these concepts, the paradox of independence. What it is, or know that periphery versus center. I wanted to do that today. I never got a chance to do that. Tracing Caribbean history. I never got the chance to do that today. So I will do that. I'll do that another time. All right. That's it.
Then, sir, before we go,
Yeah.
should we be doing a reflection piece on the class?
On this
assignment? Yes, sir.
I mean, if you want to, you can do a reflection, but I would.
Sir, yes, you went through a lot.
No, I'm not expecting a reflection for this class. No, I'm just expecting you to review the handout that I sent you. There is a lecture plan and a lecture script for this class. I'm going to ask Chantel to send the lecture script as well, since I didn't get to finish it. It's very important that you know some of these concepts. What is the difference between the center and the periphery? Okay, I didn't get to go over that. Hopefully I get to go over that. What is the paradox of independence? What it is that separates Haiti and Cuba from all the other Caribbean islands? You should know that. What it is that separates Haiti and Cuba from all the other islands. Okay? And what is the center as against the periphery? When we talk about mainstream as against taboo. We'll talk about that 2 weeks from today. That's it. We'll end. All right. You don't need to reflect on it, but you need to. You will watch the video when it becomes available, and you can do a reflection on it. Okay. The video for last week will be made available probably tonight or tomorrow. I'm still working on it. All right, guys. Take care. You guys, some of my friends in this class gonna beat me up because I ended the class late. I apologize. Take care. Yes.